Good evening. Ruth and I have always enjoyed travel, and we've been fortunate during our 70 years of marriage in having had opportunities to explore all 7 continents. This evening we're going to share with you some of our most memorable travel experiences as documented in 173 photos we've taken and 4 we didn't take, which I'll identify. These photos were taken in 48 countries. They reflect our interest in nature and wildlife and in less familiar places and people. We'll avoid the travel images that you see routinely, such as the Eiffel Tower and the Parthenon. We want to focus on places that are off the beaten track. Sometimes we were traveling with a tour company, but often we were entirely on our own. Whether or not you noticed that this session is scheduled to run until 8:30, we hope that you'll enjoy this account of some places and people that we found of special interest. Let's begin in Central and South America. The Mayan civilization flourished in Central America from about the year 250 to 900. Today we're visiting the ruins of the city of Copan in present-day Honduras. And we're looking at some of the pictographs called glyphs that constitute the Mayan writing system. This is the Mayan ruler known as 18 Rabbit. But there was no 17 Rabbit. His father was Smoke Jaguar. The ruler's modern nicknames are derived facetiously from the markings on their glyphs. Now we're at the ruins of Tikal in Guatemala. Tikal was the largest of the Mayan cities. It was swallowed up by rainforest and unknown to archaeologists until 1848. There are more than 3,000 structures here, and they're dominated by 5 enormous pyramid temples that rise above the forest canopy. Our cruise on the Amazon River in Peru, Colombia, and Brazil took us through the world's largest rainforest, which is home to 3 million species of plants and animals, as well as a handful of scattered villages. The Pantanal region in western Brazil is an enormous wetland about the size of North Dakota, and it's one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. This is how our small tour group traveled in the Pantanal. There's only one highway in the Pantanal. It's a 90-mile-long dead-end road that took us over 122 rickety wooden platforms like this that serve as bridges over culverts. The Agami heron is one of the 800 species of birds in the Pantanal. It's stunningly beautiful, but it's reclusive, so it's seldom seen. And this is a capybara. It's the world's largest rodent. Ruth is tempting it with a mango.
World's largest one.
The chestnut-eared aracari is a common species of toucan. This one perched just a few feet away as we were having breakfast. The sun bittern is another beautiful but reclusive bird. This one waded slowly past us, accompanied by its image in the water. The people of Brazil seem to be constantly celebrating festivals of one kind or another. Their costumes are always elaborate, and some are massive, but others, such as these, are quite basic. In our view, Iguazu Falls is the world's most spectacular waterfall. It winds around for almost 2 miles on the border between Brazil and Argentina. It consists of some 275 separate cataracts and falls, although the exact number depends on the season. In the rainy season, almost 500,000 cubic feet of water pour over these falls every second. The roar can be heard for miles, and the spray often creates its own rainbows. The Inca Empire stretched for 2,500 miles from Ecuador south into Chile and Argentina. And the best known Inca site is the city of Machu Picchu, high in the Andes Mountains of Peru. Machu Picchu was built in the mid-1400s and abandoned about a century later at the time of the Spanish conquest. Some 30 llamas wander about here, and the steep cliffs serve as a natural fence. The Galapagos Islands are located on the equator, 600 miles west of mainland South America, and they're home to an astonishing abundance of wildlife, including these frigate birds. To attract females, the male inflates his flamboyant throat pouch and makes a clacking sound with his bill. The Galapagos land iguana is about 3 feet long, and it's cold-blooded, so it absorbs heat from the sun by basking on the volcanic rock. The Sally Lightfoot crab is rumored to have been named for a popular Caribbean dancer. It's remarkably agile. It has 10 legs, and it can run or climb in any direction without turning. Torres del Paine National Park in southern Chile is so remote that it attracts relatively few visitors, but its mountains and waterfalls offer some of the most spectacular scenery on the planet. Never mind that it can be quite windy here.
Yeah.
And not far to the north is Glaciers National Park in Argentina, with 13 spectacular glaciers that flow into the Pacific Ocean. Now, this one is about 3 miles across. It rises 200 feet above the sea, and it extends back 19 miles inland. Just as I took this photo, a huge block of ice broke off and crashed into the ocean with a resounding roar. Antarctica may not be high on your bucket list of exciting travel destinations, but this is one of the most fascinating places we've ever been. There are 17 species of penguins here, including these aptly named chinstrap penguins. As in the Galapagos Islands, tourism is strictly controlled here, so the birds and animals are not afraid of humans, and you can walk freely among them. At Salisbury Plain on South Georgia Island, we found the ground carpeted with king penguins. Imagine you're a penguin trying to find your friend or your mate who gets separated in this confusing jumble of lookalikes. We were told that there were 250,000 king penguins in this colony, but we didn't take time to count them. In Europe, we like to visit the many small medieval towns. It's like stepping back in time. This is the picturesque German town of Rosenberg, Obertauber. It's largely unchanged from the Middle Ages. Another of our favorite German towns bears the quaint name of Dinkelsbühl. We first visited the fairy tale-like castle of Neuschwanstein in 1956. When we went back 30 years later, we found the area overrun by tourists. We had to park in a huge lot at the foot of the hill and wait in line for a shuttle bus to take us up to the castle. It was so crowded and so hot that we gave up and decided instead just to cherish the memories of our earlier visit. Carcassonne is a particularly impressive fortified city in the south of France. It's surrounded by these enormous walls that stretch for more than 2 miles and date from the early 14th century. We especially enjoyed our tour of the prehistoric cave art of southern France. This cave at Rouffignac is like a Sistine Chapel, a 13,000-year-old art. In this huge chamber, there are 20 mammoths, 12 bison, 11 horses, 3 ibex, and 3 rhinoceroses. The best known of these caves is Lascaux, that contains 6,000 figures, including animals, humans, and abstract figures. One of the most remarkable of these images is this 9-foot cow. This bridge in Seville, Spain, attracted our attention because it's so strikingly asymmetrical. This is all there is to it. There's no similar superstructure at the other end. Auschwitz was an enormous complex constructed in Poland by the Nazis in World War II for the mass extermination of the Jews of Europe. This is the innocuous exterior of one of the 4 huge gas chambers and crematoria where 1.1 million people were murdered. On a happier note, I took this photo in Novi Sad, Serbia. It's one of my favorite travel pictures because, for me, it captures qualities that most photos don't. Dubrovnik is another well-preserved medieval city. It's on the Mediterranean coast of Croatia. Its most distinctive feature is the perfectly intact 15th century wall that surrounds its whole section. There's a cable car that conveniently took us up the mountain for this view. We've seen many Greek and Roman theaters across Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, but this theater at Epidaurus, Greece, is one of the largest and the best preserved. It was built in the late 4th century BCE. It can seat 14,000 people, and the acoustics are absolutely perfect. You can hear every syllable spoken, even in the last row. This is what remains of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, Greece. People from all around the Mediterranean came here for advice from the Oracle of Delphi when they faced important decisions. Apollo spoke through Pythia, his high priestess. I asked our guide whether over her 1,100-year tenure, Pythia didn't occasionally give erroneous forecasts that undermined the confidence of her clients. He said that her advice always came in the form of riddles or ambiguities that were subject to interpretation. For example, when a couple asked whether their son would be killed in a coming battle, they were told, "He will return, not in battle will he perish." When he was killed in the battle and they came back for an explanation, they were told that they had misunderstood the words of the oracle. They thought they heard, "He will return, not in battle will he perish." But what Pythia claimed to have said was, "He will return not, in battle will he perish." So the meaning could depend entirely on where you place the punctuation. This is what's left of the throne room in the palace of Agamemnon at Mycenae, Greece. This is the room where, according to Homer, Agamemnon, the supreme king, assembled the lesser kings of Greece around 1250 BCE to plan an expedition across the Aegean Sea to Troy to return Helen, the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. At Meteora, Greece, we saw a series of enormous rock columns with monasteries built on them. For 600 years, the only way to enter or leave these monasteries was by means of a basket on a rope. We entered this one by crossing these tiny bridges, but the bridges date only from the 1920s. Imagine how difficult it must have been to build these structures in the 14th century. The chapels in these monasteries are decorated magnificently. In many of these rooms, it seems that every square inch is painted. And some of these decorations date from the 16th century. No photography is allowed inside. We found this photo on the internet. Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Turkey, was completed in 537. And for almost 1,000 years, this was the largest cathedral in the world. The main dome shown here is as high as a 15-story building. In 1453, with the fall of the Roman Empire of the East, it became a mosque. And in 1934, it was converted into a museum. Then in 2020, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan made it a mosque again. But because of its unique history, it remains open to everyone. Cappadocia in central Turkey is the site of more than 100 churches, homes, and other structures carved into the soft volcanic ash. It's also a favorite site for ballooning because of the distinctive geological formations in the area. And we counted 42 balloons in the air that morning, along with ours. In all of the Roman cities we visited, none of the homes were more impressive than these residences at Ephesus on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. Despite extensive damage, the elegant mosaics and frescoes here provide some of the best evidence of Roman domestic life that survives anywhere. These houses were inhabited for 800 years, from the 1st century BCE to the 7th century CE. And we wondered how many of today's homes will be habitable for 800 years. I'm using the newer terms BCE and CE instead of the older terms BC and AD. BCE means before the Common Era, and CE means Common Era. At the remains of Troy in northwest Turkey, we were shown evidence of 9 layers of successive cities built one over another for 3,500 years, beginning around 3000 BCE. The Troy described by Homer is probably Troy 7, which existed from about 1300 to 1050 BCE. These are the walls around which we're told that Achilles dragged the dead body of Hector. On the floor of a church in Mudaba, Jordan, we saw this extraordinary 6th century mosaic map of the Holy Land. And this map depicts the area from Lebanon in the north to the Nile Delta in the south. And at the center, there's a close-up of Jerusalem. The map originally covered 500 square feet, and it contained more than 2 million hand-cut pieces of colored stone, but only about a third of it has survived. We toured Carrick Castle in western Jordan, one of the largest and most formidable of what was intended to be a solid line of castles built by the Crusaders, a day's journey apart, stretching from Turkey in the north to the Gulf of Aqaba in the south. Construction of Carrick Castle began in 1142, and it was completed in 20 years, but it fell to the Muslims only 25 years after it was finished. The city of Petra in southern Jordan had been abandoned for more than 1,000 years when it was discovered by a Swiss explorer in 1812. Like most visitors, we approached through this deep, narrow, 3/4 mile long slot canyon with walls that tower up to 600 feet above us. Notice the size of the people at the bottom of our photo. Then suddenly the canyon opens and we see Petra's magnificent so-called treasury building carved into the immense sandstone cliffs. There's probably no other travel experience in the world that can match the drama of the entry into Petra. We like to travel to places that are rich in history and culture, and there are a few places more rich in history and culture than Iran. We spent 3 weeks there in 2009, and that was one of the most memorable trips we've ever taken. One highlight, of course, was the ruins of Persepolis. Persepolis was founded in 518 BCE by the Persian ruler Darius I, but 200 years later it was sacked and burned by Alexander the Great. The main entrance shown here was erected by Xerxes I, and his name is carved here in 3 languages so that everyone who entered would know who was responsible for all of this grandeur. These life-size soldiers of the Imperial Guard are protecting the throne room at Persepolis. The Imperial Guard consisted of Persian and Median nobility placed alternatingly. The Persians are the ones with fluted caps, and the Medes have rounded caps with tails. This is one corner of the huge Imam Square in Isfahan, Iran. This is the 2nd largest public square in the world after Tiananmen, and Isfahan is one of the most beautiful cities we've ever seen. For example, the mosaics and the calligraphy and the sheer spectacle of structures like this mosque on Imam Square are absolutely stunning. And there are buildings like this all across Iran. It was obvious that the present government does not enjoy the unanimous support of the people. One day at lunch in Isfahan, we sat next to our local guide, a young woman who told us about being out there in the streets protesting the fraudulent election of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad a few months earlier. And at several sites, we saw young women with strands of hair showing from beneath their hijabs and apparently deliberate efforts to defy the authorities. Failure by women to cover their hair is illegal here. Officially, it's an offense to public decency and is punishable by prison time. But that law has become the source of nationwide protest, and in recent months, more than 500 people have been killed by the police and more than 20,000 arrested in demonstrations arising from the death last year of a young woman in police custody charged with wearing her hijab improperly. The government of Iran is a menace to the people of the world and an oppressor of its own people. But we were in every part of the country, and we've never been any place where the people were more friendly. It's one of the great tragedies of our time that a population so well educated and so hard-working should be subjected to a government so repressive and so backward-looking as the present theocracy in Iran. Another especially memorable trip was our journey on the Silk Road, the ancient trade route across Central Asia that connected China to the west for 1,600 years, beginning in the 2nd century BCE. This is the main gate into the city of Bukhara, Uzbekistan. The gigantic, relentless 100-year struggle between Britain and Russia that took place here in Central Asia from the fall of Napoleon to World War I has been called the Great Game, but it was deadly serious for the military forces involved and for the hundreds of secret agents and adventurers who took part. This is the minaret in Bukhara from which criminals and heretics and suspected spies were thrown to their deaths. And near here, we stood on the spot where in 1842, 2 British officers were ceremonially beheaded. This is one section of the enormous Registan Square in the legendary city of Samarkand, Uzbekistan. Everywhere you look in Samarkand, there are marvelous architectural monuments. And many of these buildings date from the time of the Mongol conqueror Tamerlane in the 14th century. The dazzling mosaic or turquoise tiles and the mosaics here show unsurpassed workmanship. And these are some of the finest examples of Islamic architecture that exist anywhere in the world. We especially enjoy the sprawling, chaotic marketplaces throughout Asia and Africa, like this one in Samarkand. These bustling scenes are always colorful and crowded and full of energy. Dunhuang is an oasis on the eastern edge of the vast Taklamakan Desert in northern China. And just a few miles outside town are the Mogao Caves. There are some 500 caves here carved into these sandstone cliffs between the 4th and the 14th centuries, and they're decorated with almost 500,000 square feet of magnificent murals that represent some of the world's finest examples of Buddhist art. These caves were dedicated as shrines to ensure the safe travel of wealthy merchant donors who were eager to invoke divine protection as they headed west into the hostile desert on the Silk Road, or if they were coming east to give thanks for their safe crossing. Just outside Dunhuang, we were taken for a camel ride. Camels are well designed to survive in the desert, but they're not well designed for carrying riders. It's easy to get on a camel when it's sitting down. The hard part is staying on as it gets up. First, you find yourself thrown violently to the front and then hurled forcefully to the back. The Great Wall of China extends for more than 3,000 miles, and in the west, it ends here at the 14th century fort at Jiaguan on the edge of the Gobi Desert. Ruth has many tales of women's restrooms of dubious hygienic standards, and her most unforgettable facility is located here at Jiaguan. What made this restroom particularly notable, she says, is that it did not appear to have been cleaned since the Ming Dynasty. Now we're in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, and this is the immense Potala Palace with 13 floors, 1,000 rooms, 10,000 shrines, and 200,000 statues. Traditionally, this palace was the main residence of the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhists, but when Tibet was annexed by China in 1951, the Dalai Lama fled to exile in India to escape from the communist government. Here's a Tibetan family having lunch on a balcony at a monastery we visited near Lhasa. There's a strong worldwide movement in support of independence for Tibet, but that's not going to happen. And one reason is that Tibet provides China with a protective buffer against India. This morning we set off from Lhasa for Gyeongsa, Tibet. The distance is only 220 miles, but it took all day. To begin, we spent several hours climbing the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. This is a bleak, desolate landscape. At a 17,000-foot pass in the mountains, we found this man inviting tourists for a small fee to be photographed sitting on his yak. This appeared to be an extraordinarily difficult way to earn a living because we saw no other travelers all day on that lonely mountain road. We came to a plateau and stopped for a picnic lunch. We had a second vehicle for our luggage and supplies. This was a lovely setting despite the lack of tables or facilities. The women's restroom was on one side of the van and the men's was on the other. In the early afternoon, we passed the Snow Dragon restaurant, and we could understand why our tour company had asked our hotel to prepare a box lunch for us. There were no cars outside, which is never a good recommendation. In fact, we saw no cars, no gas stations, no motels, no other restaurants, and no sign of human habitation all day on that desolate road in the backcountry of Tibet. This is the Nyala Pola Temple in the historic city of Bhaktapur, Nepal. It was a spectacular 5-story pagoda built in 1701 and filled with statues that showed exquisite craftsmanship. Remember this photo so that you can compare it with the next one. In April 2015, this area was devastated by a 7.8 earthquake that destroyed that temple and 66 other structures in the area. This photo that Ruth found on the internet was taken from the same spot that we took the previous photo before the temple was destroyed. Many of the tourists in Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, are Hindu and Buddhist pilgrims. And of course, local entrepreneurs do their best to ensure that every visitor has ample opportunities to purchase souvenirs. This is the iconic Tiger's Nest Monastery near Paro, Bhutan. Both Bhutan and Nepal are tiny landlocked countries nestled in the Himalayas between India and China. Bhutan kept itself totally isolated from the rest of the world until the 1970s. The first tourists were allowed entry in 1974. The only traffic light in Bhutan had been installed recently in the capital, Thimphu. It was a gift from the people of the Netherlands, but the people of Thimphu found it confusing, and it was soon removed. We passed below here often, but we didn't take this photo. One morning in Kanha National Park in India, we went to look for tigers, but instead of riding in jeeps, we were mounted on elephants, and we had no trouble finding tigers. Another day, while birding in Ranthambore National Park, India, we paused for a picnic lunch in our vehicle. We had to be alert because these macaque monkeys would grab any food we weren't guarding. This morning we're in the Asakusa district of Tokyo, Japan. This temple was originally built in 942, destroyed by fire in 1631, and again by an air raid in 1945, but rebuilt each time. Many buildings in Japan, especially wooden ones, have a similar history of repeated destruction and rebuilding. Kyoto is the cultural capital of Japan. In this temple in Kyoto, there are 1,001 statues of Kannon, the Buddhist goddess of mercy. Each one has a unique face, we were told, and each one is covered with gold leaf. Ruth took this image from a postcard because no photos are allowed inside, which is often the case in temples. This is the Temple of the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto. It's a 3-story structure in a lovely setting, and the 2 upper floors are covered with gold leaf. When these beautifully dressed geishas saw that I was trying to take their picture, they stopped and waited so I didn't have to hurry, which I thought was very considerate. Western media sometimes portray geishas as prostitutes, but in fact they're respected young professional women who are highly trained in the traditional Japanese performing arts, especially music and dance. This huge arch marks the Arctic Circle. Today we're in Siberia on the Pacific coast of Russia. The mountains here are rugged and bare, and the tundra was soggy beneath our feet. As we sailed along the coast of Russia, we didn't have to look at the direction of the water from our faucet to tell us that our ship was rocking. Ruth enjoys choppy water, but I don't. This giant figure is guarding the entrance to the Temple of the Emerald Buddha in Bangkok, Thailand. Bangkok is filled with magnificently ornate Buddhist temples, and the interiors are as sumptuously decorated as the exteriors. Many of these statues and other surfaces here are generously covered with gold leaf. Cambodia is the home of the Khmer ethnic group that dominated much of Southeast Asia for more than 600 years, beginning around 800. This ornate entrance to the Hindu temple at Bante Shrine is guarded by a figure that's part man and part lion. This temple at Ta Proang, Cambodia, has been embraced and swallowed by a vast tangle of crisscrossing roots from the trees in the jungle. They swarm over it like a chaotic herd of snakes. We were up early this morning to watch the sunrise over the iconic temple of Angkor Wat. There were more than 1,000 temples in the huge ancient megacity of Angkor, but Angkor Wat was the largest, and it remains the supreme masterpiece of Khmer architecture. These stairs lead up to the third level at Angkor Wat. Once only the king and high priest were allowed on that level, but today, as you can see, everyone is. At the temple of Bayan in Angkor Thom, I found myself nose to nose with the 12th century king Jayavarman VII. Actually, his face was many times larger than mine and much further away. Vietnam has undergone a remarkable recovery since the 1970s. This dragon bridge at Da Nang was designed and built by American companies, and every weekend after sunset there's a pyrotechnic show in which the dragon roars and spits fearsome plumes of fire. The Phu Quoc Assembly Hall in Hoi An, Vietnam, was built around 1690 by immigrants from Fujian province in China to give them a place to worship and socialize. The rural infrastructure in Vietnam is very basic. To visit the tiny village of An Hung, we crossed this rickety footbridge. It would never satisfy Western liability standards, but we passed over it and returned without incident. Another afternoon, we visited this boisterous, raucous floating market at Kai Bay in the delta of the Mekong River. People were busily engaged in buying and selling fish, poultry, fruits, vegetables, flowers, and so on. Borneo is the third largest island in the world after Greenland and New Guinea, and it's one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, with huge numbers of plants and animals found nowhere else on the planet, including this Rafflesia. This is the world's largest flower. Its blossoms can be more than 3 feet across, but it has no stem, no leaves, or no roots. It grows as a parasite on other plants, and they supply its nutrients and water. The coast of New Guinea is lined with spectacular stretches of coral reef. This is a raspberry coral, and behind it is a brave coral with a couple of tiny orange sea squirts on the right. We've seen stunningly beautiful coral on the Virgin Islands and the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, but on this trip we had a new underwater camera, so we could better capture the elegance of the scene. This elegant elkhorn coral is structurally complex with its many branches, but like much other coral, it's critically endangered. In 1988, this section of seafloor was covered with lava from a volcanic eruption. But I took this photo 27 years later, in 2015, and you can see that the coral is recovering very nicely. Lava contains minerals that provide a beneficial environment for building new coral reefs. The itinerary for our visit to New Guinea was nothing like the usual route for cruise ships. This was a very special one-time adventure that included several locations seldom seen by tourists. Today we were taken to a remote village of the Asmat people who have had very little contact with outsiders. we were greeted by warriors in their war canoes. In 1961, Michael Rockefeller, the son of the governor of New York, disappeared in this area while he was collecting materials for the Metropolitan Museum. His body was never found, but several investigations produced convincing evidence that he was killed and eaten by headhunters from a village near here. But our tour company had very thoughtfully arranged for us to be welcomed rather than eaten. One of the guest speakers on our ship was an anthropologist, Lawrence Blair, who had visited this village 29 years earlier. Some of the older villagers remembered him, and they told us that no tourists had been here since his visit 29 years ago. We were allowed to witness an extraordinary, rarely performed spirit mask ceremony. This was entirely authentic and not merely a show for tourists. In the spirit mask ceremony, men wearing costumes like this assumed the identities of dead ancestors. The ancestors are symbolically visiting the living to affirm their close relationship. This elderly man has had his nose pierced with a curved nautilus shell, which can't have been comfortable. He was astonished when he recognized himself in Lawrence Blair's photos from 29 years ago. In fact, all of the village elders were astonished and fascinated when Blair showed them the photos from his earlier visit. Another day, in another village, these young women performed their colorful ribbon dance for us. In Iran, the women in our tour group had to conform to the strict dress code imposed on the women in that country. But here, there were no bothersome rules of any kind, either for visitors or for local women. The paternity of children here is often unknown, but this is a matrilineal society in which children become part of their mother's clan rather than their father's, so paternity is largely irrelevant anyway. Australia's most distinctive natural icon is Ayers Rock, now known by its Aboriginal name, Uluru. We had a good view of Uluru from our plane just before we landed at the well-known outback town of Alice Springs. Uluru is 2 miles long, 1.5 miles wide, and more than 1,100 feet high. We climbed Uluru on our 35th wedding anniversary in 1988. Some 37 climbers have fallen to their deaths here, often while chasing headgear that blew off in the strong winds. King Charles of the UK, when he was Prince of Wales, had visited here just a few weeks earlier, but he climbed only to the level called Chicken Rock, some 40 feet above the base. An Australian friend had offered to take us along on a 4-day vacation in the outback with his family following a conference at which I was speaking, which we thought was extraordinarily generous. The outback is generally dry and sunny like this. The tiny town of Blenheim had received only 1 millimeter of rain in the 8 months before our visit, but the evening we arrived, there was a long soaking rain. The hotel owner provided buckets to place around our room to catch the water from leaks in the roof, and we found a dry area to move our bed to. Our Australian friends had warned us about the primitive conditions in the outback, but we enjoyed every adventure-packed moment. There's an air of casual informality in the outback that we found quite charming. These public restrooms in Wellington, capital of New Zealand, resemble some sort of sea creatures with their cantilever tails that provide ventilation. These structures rank near the top on every list of the world's best public toilets. Now we've wandered 10,000 miles to the west across the Indian Ocean, and we're in the Medina in Cairo, Egypt. The Medina is the old Arab quarter in a North African city. Every Medina is a honeycomb of narrow passageways lined with shops that offer almost anything money can buy. And if it's not in stock, the shopkeeper can get it for you in 5 minutes. In the vast span of Egyptian history, this temple of Edfu is quite new. It was begun in 237 BCE by Ptolemy III and completed 180 years later by Ptolemy XIII. Today, it's considered the best preserved of all of the temples of ancient Egypt. This is the massive pylon or gateway at Edfu. Karnak is perhaps the most impressive of all the Egyptian antiquities, and the great hypostyle hall is probably Karnak's most impressive feature. This hall was built in the 13th century BCE. It's a 54,000 square foot forest of 134 enormous columns that dwarf the tourist. It's one of the most spectacular buildings we've ever seen. This wall at the temple at Dendera shows Cleopatra as pharaoh with her son Caesarion. Caesarion's father was Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra intended that Caesarion become the next pharaoh of Egypt. But when the forces of Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium, Egypt became a province of Rome, and there were no more pharaohs after Cleopatra. The carvings and hieroglyphics at these temples were once brightly colored in red, green, yellow, and blue. Here, we're looking upward, and we can see that this ceiling and these upper walls have retained some of their original color. We're standing now inside the tomb of King Tut in the Valley of the Kings. He was only 9 years old when he became pharaoh in 1332 BCE, and he died at age 19. He would likely have remained completely unknown if it were not for the remarkable discovery of his tomb by Howard Carter in 1922. Tut's tomb was a special treasure for archaeologists because it had not been looted. Some of the most extensive and best preserved Roman ruins in the world are found in Libya. This is the main street in the Roman city of Sabratha, Libya. Ruth and I lived in Libya for 2 years when I was stationed there in the Air Force. We went back precisely 50 years later and found that in Sabratha, nothing had changed. Ruth was wearing a red sweater in 1955 and a blue shirt in 2005, but otherwise everything was the same as a half century earlier, except that the tree on the left hadn't survived. All across North Africa and the Middle East, we've seen wonderful mosaics that date from Roman times, but more often than not, they're uncovered and completely exposed to the weather. The crown jewel of all the Roman settlements in North Africa is the city of Leptis Magna in Libya. And this is the arch of Septimius Severus in Leptis Magna. He was born here in 145, and he became Emperor of Rome. So there are many buildings here that are more grandiose than would normally be found in a provincial city. And this is the enormous forum of Septimius Severus at Leptis Magna. Obviously, there is a great deal of restoration work yet to be done here. We explored Tunisia driving our own car, and we visited several Roman sites that are now completely abandoned. This is the Roman city of Tuga, and there was no sign of life for miles around in any direction, except for one shepherd and a few sheep. We spent an entire day wandering around in the Medina in Fez, Morocco. This is Ruth in the hat and our local guide, Saida, in red. Saida especially enjoyed showing us around Fez, where she grew up. Morocco is famous for its leather products. And here we're on the top floor of a tannery, looking down at the vats in which animal skins are soaked for up to 6 days, first in lime in the white vats to remove the hair and fur, and then in vats of colored dye to produce a soft, pliable leather that makes beautiful purses, watches, wallets, luggage, and so forth. The most popular tourist destination in Morocco is Marrakesh. The bewildering array of shops in the Medina and Marrakesh range from stalls no bigger than kiosks to scruffy storefronts that may open into glittering modern stores once you're inside. Markets such as this one in Meknes, Morocco, have changed very little through the centuries. You can capture the images and the sounds of a place like this, but you can't capture the smells. Good or bad smells are often an essential feature of the environment. The 17th century Moroccan ruler, Sultan Moulay Ismail, who was known for his cruelty, built this gate here in Meknes. It's called Bab Mansour after its architect. It's said to be the most beautiful gate and most magnificent gate, I should say, in North Africa. We're told that when it was completed, Ismail asked Mansour if it would be possible for him to build a more magnificent gate. Mansour was puzzled, but he felt compelled to say yes. That was the wrong answer. In order to avoid the possibility that some other ruler might someday have a more magnificent gate, Ismail had Mansour executed. This is part of the vegetable section in the enormous sprawling market in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso in West Africa. This is one of the poorest countries in the world, with 40%, more than 40% of the population living in poverty. Now we're next door in Mali, which has an even higher poverty rate. And in Mali, it's accompanied by the 4th highest fertility rate in the world, with 5.5 births per woman compared with the global rate of a little over 2. These figures don't suggest a promising future for Mali. This morning we're in a tiny village of the Dogon people in Mali, and we're witnessing a series of colorful, energetic dances relating the mythology of the Dogon people and their ancestors and their relationship with their environment. The performers included about 3 dozen dancers and musicians, mostly in masks. The stilt walkers represent wading birds. Notice the very tall masks on the 2 seated dancers just left of center. And they represent serpents. These masks are 10 feet tall, and they're stabilized by bars held in the dancer's teeth. We were also shown the grotto of circumcision here, where we were told the ritual is performed by the village blacksmith. We didn't inquire further. To reach Timbuktu, we sailed for 2 days in this tiny boat on the Niger River. There were only 4 of us in our tour group. The other 2 were women about our age, and we were cared for by a crew of 4. Ruth grew up on the Ohio River, and she loves rivers, so these 2 leisurely days were a highlight of the trip for her. At sundown, we simply pulled ashore on a deserted beach and and set up our little campsite. We have never felt more utterly removed from civilization than that quiet night on a lonely beach along the peaceful Niger River in far-off Mali, West Africa. We were shown around Timbuktu by a local guide of the Tuareg tribe. This mud mosque was almost 200 years old when Columbus first sailed for the New World. Some people today may think of Timbuktu as a mythical place, but in the 15th and 16th centuries, this was one of the greatest centers of learning on the continent, with a major university and 3 important mosques. The libraries here once housed 300,000 volumes, some dating from as early as the 11th century. Notice the satellite dish in our photo. One evening, these Tuareg men performed a ceremonial dance for us. In 2014, 4 years after our visit, Al-Qaeda jihadists took control of northern Mali and set off a prolonged and violent conflict. The UN sent in a peacekeeping force led by the French, but the fighting continues today. Dozens of people were killed in a series of attacks earlier this month. Madagascar is a large island in the Indian Ocean off the east coast of Africa, and it's another of the world's greatest hotspots of ecological diversity. An astonishing 90% of the plant and animal species found here, including this 3-eyed lizard, exists nowhere else on Earth. And here's a lesser hedgehog tenrak. It's about the size of a grapefruit. It has poor eyesight, but its whiskers are very sensitive, and it relies chiefly on tactile communication. Madagascar is best known for its lemurs. This is a ringtail lemur with her baby. There are no lemurs anywhere else in the world, but there are more than 100 species here in Madagascar. They range in weight from a few ounces to 20 pounds. The largest weighed more than 400 pounds, but all of the larger species are extinct today. This eye-catching creature is a sifaka lemur. It gets its name from its piercing call. We were awakened every morning in this camp by sifakas calling and jumping about on the roof of our cabin. And this is an Indri lemur. It's the largest of the surviving lemurs, more than 2 feet long. Sadly, 98% of the remaining lemur species are threatened with extinction. Today we're in Tanzania in East Africa. East Africa has the greatest concentration of large mammals found anywhere in the world. And it also has a spectacular assortment of beautiful birds, such as this gray-crowned crane. It has a red pouch on its neck that's inflated when it makes its booming call. As we explored the vast Serengeti plains, we found lions everywhere. This male was relaxing leisurely at the side of the road, and he paid no attention to us, even though we stopped to look at him. Male lions spend most of their time relaxing like this. They wait for the females to find dinner for them. The females do about 90% of the hunting for a lion pride. When elephants decide to cross the road, you simply have to wait. This group came out of the bush and sauntered slowly across in front of us. There were only 3 in our tour group, so we could always stand up in our Land Cruiser for an unobstructed view. These elephants passed so close that we could have touched them. They were relaxed and easygoing, and they paid no attention to us. Here on the Serengeti Plains, our accommodations consisted of a so-called mobile camp. That term refers to tents set up by our staff wherever they expect the wildlife to be most abundant. This is our tent seen from the rear. The staff would pour a couple of buckets of hot water into the container over this enclosure, and that was our shower. The third member of our party was Nancy, a nurse from Kansas, and we had a staff of 7 taking care of the 3 of us. On the left is our dining tent. On the right is the kitchen tent. There was a tent further off to the right for the staff and one off to the left for Nancy. Ruth was apprehensive here because there was no protective fence, and she was certain that any lion that wanted to get into our tent could easily do so. I assured her that couldn't happen because lions don't have opposable thumbs, so they couldn't unzip the flap at the front of the tent. But she was unconvinced. Still, our 3 nights here were uneventful once we got used to the various animals in the distance roaring and braying and trumpeting throughout the night, and the monkeys scrambling about on top of our tent. When we crossed into Kenya, we had a great view of Mount Kilimanjaro just across the border in Tanzania. It's the tallest mountain in Africa, more than 19,000 feet high. This is a vulturine guinea fowl. It's the largest species of guinea fowl, more than 2 feet tall. This is one of the more remarkable animals we've seen, and it's very rare. It's a gerenuk, or giraffe antelope. Gerenuks stand on their hind legs, browse on leaves out of reach of all the other animals except giraffes. They're no more than 40 inches tall at the shoulder, but they reach a height of about 7 feet. They use their front legs to pull down the branches. We visited a village of the Samburu people in Kenya, and these Samburu women are welcoming Ruth and Nancy with dancing. The Samburu are known for the multiple strands of beads and fabric they use to make their colorful necklaces and collars. This is a dung beetle. The dung beetle breaks down animal droppings into little balls and rolls them home. It needs no other food or drink because dung provides all the nutrients it requires. Small insects like the dung beetle aren't major tourist attractions, but they play an indispensable role in nature's recycling of nutrients. Now we're in the famous Masai Mara National Reserve in Kenya. This lioness and her cubs stared at us as we stared back. This image is not zoomed up. We were actually as close as it appears, and that's not at all unusual. One night here, Ruth woke me saying that she heard gunfire nearby. The national elections held a few days earlier had been marred by apparently well-founded charges of fraud and vote breaking, and there was an immediate eruption of appalling violence and destruction in which 1,100 people were killed. I reminded her that it was New Year's Eve, but I don't think she went back to sleep. One morning we came upon the carcass of a Cape buffalo that had been killed and partially eaten the night before, and we watched as this lion came up and dragged the carcass about 100 feet to a more protected site. Then he began to feed. There's a strict pecking order here. The males eat first, and then the females, and after that, the other scavengers in turn can have a seat at the table. We spent more than an hour quietly watching this dramatic scene unfold. When he finished, the females could eat. Since the females do most of the hunting, they had probably killed the buffalo. But the male patrols the territory, and he protects the pride, and for that he gets the lion's share, so to speak. Lions can't strip all the meat off the bones because of the shape of their jaws. When the females had eaten all they could get hold of, they left and the vultures began to arrive. Lappet-faced vultures have powerful bills that can tear through the tough hide and muscles. White-backed vultures can't open the carcass, but once it's open, they can reach deep inside with their long featherless necks to get at the intestines and other soft tissue. Hooded vultures have fine bills for picking meat from between the bones. When a hyena showed up, the vultures got out of its way. Hyena's jaws are so powerful they can crush bones. The hyena has pulled off the pelvic section and he's taking it away, presumably for his family, and the vultures are happy to see him leave. When all of these animals had eaten in their respective turns, there was very little left. But there are still meals here for rodents, beetles, ants, and other insects. This was a particularly dramatic and vivid demonstration of the ruthless efficiency of nature. Victoria Falls lies on the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia. It's one of the world's great waterfalls, but it's difficult to appreciate because it's more than a mile wide and it pours into a narrow canyon, so there's no single spot from which you can see more than a small portion of the complete panorama. We took this picture from a helicopter. At our camp in Namibia, we watched this Damara red-billed hornbill raiding the tea cakes at our breakfast buffet. Botswana is the home of the Kalahari Desert, the Okavango Delta, and this African Cape buffalo. The Cape buffalo can weigh a ton, and it's a very dangerous animal. This one has a red-billed oxpecker perched on its nose. This large animal is a common waterbuck. Its long, curved horns can reach 40 inches in length. As we were flying from one camp to another in Botswana, we could see from the air that all of the trails in the area converged on this water hole. We had come during the dry season because the animals tend to collect at the water holes. When we landed, we saw this sign, which seemed to exaggerate the importance of the site. Actually, there are two buildings at this landing strip. The one on the left is the fire station. Its equipment consisted of 4 buckets of sand. The building on the right contained restrooms, which are a luxury here in the bush. Birds aren't the only wildlife attracted to dining areas. Here's a dwarf mongoose descending headfirst into a juice glass to get the last drop. And there's another one waiting its turn. We watched this lion stroll by in front of us with a young buffalo he had just killed. As usual, he paid no attention at all to us. This morning we came upon a leopard stalking a herd of buffalo. He's gotten quite close, but they know he's there, so nothing is likely to happen here for a while. Now he's hiding behind a huge termite mound. He won't act until he has identified a particular individual as his victim. We watched as he climbed a tree to get a better view. Leopards are exceptionally good at climbing trees. A leopard can drag a heavy carcass up into a tree for safekeeping. From this vantage point, he can survey the scene much better. Stalking prey is far more difficult and time-consuming than it appears on TV. And leopards are successful in only about 38% of their chases. That's not as good as cheetahs, which are successful about 58% of the time, but it's better than lions with a success rate of only 25%. It didn't help this leopard that we were hanging around and watching his every move. We took these next photos in the famous Kruger National Park in South Africa. We were in a rental car on our own with no guide, and we experienced close encounters with large mammals every few minutes. The greater kudu is the second largest of the antelope species after the eland. The magnificent horns in the male kudu spiral 2.5 to 3 times, and if they were straightened, they'd be almost 4 feet long. The markings on giraffes vary by species in shape, size, and color. These are southern giraffes, and their spots are quite different from the spots we saw on the Maasai giraffes in Tanzania or the reticulated giraffes in Kenya. Giraffes especially like the leaves of the acacia tree. A giraffe's tongue is about 1.5 feet long, and this helps the animal to bypass the thorns and reach the leaves. We found these baobab trees everywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. The baobab tree is nicknamed the upside-down tree. It's a deciduous tree with a very thick trunk and a root-like canopy at the top. So in the dry season, when it's lost its leaves, it looks like it's been uprooted and replanted upside down. This rare trumpeter hornbill has a conspicuous horny ridge at the top of its bill that's hollow and serves to amplify the bird's loud trumpet-like call. When we saw this martial eagle at the side of the road, we pulled over to watch. This is one of the world's largest eagles with a wingspan of more than 6 feet, and it had just caught a rock monitor lizard, one of the world's largest lizards, more than 3 feet long. Before it began to eat the lizard, the eagle carefully pulled off each leg so the lizard couldn't get away, which we thought was a very shrewd thing to do. Life is tough in the world of nature. But you don't have to leave North America to have enormously rewarding travel experiences. Here's a scene in Hopewell Rocks Provincial Park in New Brunswick in eastern Canada. Notice the level of the water against the rocks. Just a few hours earlier, I had photographed the same location with Ruth waving from the ocean floor. This park is on the Bay of Fundy, which has the highest tides in the world, some 50 feet at this point. If you lie down to relax on the beach here, we suggest that you not go to sleep. I was showing a reckless and uncharacteristic disregard for the Keep on Trail signs in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park when I walked alongside a massive stream of white-hot molten lava gushing from Kilauea volcano as it flowed relentlessly toward the sea. And I watched as it poured into the ocean, creating enormous clouds of hissing steam. But you have to be careful where you step here. In the final analysis, we think that the most spectacular natural wonder on the planet is the Grand Canyon in Arizona. It attracts more than 4 million visitors a year. And you'll probably find that most of them are there at the same time you are. But most of them go to the south rim. So if you go to the north rim, where we took this photo, it'll be quieter and far less crowded. Finally, here's a photo from a trip I took on my 90th birthday. It was a short trip, only 2 miles, but it was entirely vertical in the air rather than horizontal on the ground. Unfortunately, I couldn't persuade Ruth to come along, nor to try this on her own 90th birthday. I had read on the internet that the world record for older people skydiving is 103. So I told the owner of the establishment that I would come back on my 104th birthday to set a new record. He told me that on that day my jump would be free of charge. And I realized later that I should have gotten that promise in writing because he didn't look as though he would make it for another 14 years. We know that many of you have traveled widely and probably share our view that travel is one of the most rewarding experiences anyone can engage in. The world is an overwhelmingly vast arena with a staggering diversity of spectacular places and fascinating people. And it's enormously satisfying to become familiar with as many of them as we can. Thank you for coming this evening.